So thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be back, and it's so exciting for me. It's one of my messages in the book that pivot and our jobs and the economy, it's so fluid now that this to me is really a joy. That even though I left Google as a full-time employee, to still come back and partner and talk and be here. As I was reflecting on what would be most meaningful to share today, it occurred to me that to the outside world, hitting a pivot point or plateau at Google is a bit of an oxymoron. You should be nothing but 100% fulfilled and 100% grateful 100% of the time. Hashtag blessed. But in some ways, it's its own first world career problem that we feel, and we feel that there's something wrong with us if we hit a plateau or a pivot point and very naturally start asking, what's next? What's next within my role, within the company, within my broader career? Where am I trying to go? And we start to internalize some of this shame and blame that I think we feel from the outside world. Like, you're so lucky, I would kill for that job. And I used to get this a lot. And I don't know if any of you going to parties or meeting someone at a conference, the first question is, what's the food like? Or what's the culture like? And all of a sudden, it seems unreasonable to talk about what's really going on and how you might really be feeling. And that it goes in very natural waves. What's interesting is that I still am experiencing this even 5.5 years out. I left Google. I started in 2006 as the company had 6,000 employees and was here as it grew to 36,000. And when my first book was coming out, I left to kind of go all in and give myself 6 months to see if I could make it. And here I am 5.5 years later, not without its ups and downs. But I'll give an example, this kind of judgment that comes. So one of the early reviews for the book came in Success magazine, and this is before the book was even out. And the reporter writes, "How ironic is it that a career development manager at Google's much envied Career Guru program hit a career plateau and needed to take a sabbatical?" I'll play that back for you. She says, "How ironic is it that a career development program manager at Google at Google's much envied Career Guru program hit a career plateau and needed to take a sabbatical?" At first I thought, ouch, that stings. And then I realized you should want nothing less of the teams working here on career development and Career Guru and internal coaching than for them to be asking these big questions. So I don't find it ironic at all. I actually think it's really important that we think about and consider what's next. And Career Guru is something that I'm very passionate about. Becky and I worked on this together during our time here. And the mission was to provide drop-in coaching for any Googler so that if people wanted to talk about their career in a kind of safe, neutral way, we always, of course, are encouraging talking to your manager, but also to have a space to think about what's next. And before we go any further, let me just say that pivoting, sometimes people get the wrong impression from the book title, that it always means drastic career changes, changing your career completely. That's not it at all. So a pivot is inherently one related thing into the next, and you can even pivot within your role. So the way that, as I wrote this book and started researching it, it's really a mindset and a method for mapping your next move. So a lot of what we'll do, I'll share some context and what I discovered in working on this book, and then there will be some time for you to reflect today too, because ultimately pivots are very personal. And not only is there nothing wrong with you if you've hit a pivot point or plateau, but that's as to be expected. That in fact, and especially at a company like Google, hitting a pivot point is a product of your success. It means that you've acclimated to the role that you're in and the nature of the tasks that are a part of your role. And now you're very naturally looking to say, okay, what else? Give me more. How else can I grow here? When I started unpacking this question, first I had two main questions. One, how can people be as agile as startups? And then two, how do we get better at asking and answering this question, what's next? So a little bit about my background. I was working at a startup out of college. In fact, I was studying political science, took a leave of absence to work with a professor at a startup as the first employee. One of my roles, maybe 5 to 10% of my role, was managing our Google AdWords accounts. And when I hit a plateau there, I moved over to Google on the AdWords product training team. The career conversation that I regret the most is the one I never had. And that was with the founder of the startup, that instead of telling him, I've hit a plateau here, what else can we do, how can I grow in my role, I started interviewing for Google in my car on lunch breaks. But I ended up, so thankful to get that role on the training and development team. 2 years in, I hit another pivot point. And once again, at that point, I really thought something was wrong with me. I'm at Google, I'm at the Disneyland of companies. What's wrong here? And my role had shifted. I had become a manager. I was working on a lot of PowerPoint strategy decks. And I felt like there was some element that was missing. So thankfully, because of a serendipitous run-in with Becky Cotton in the parking lot, she said, there's this career development team forming, and there's a role open. You should apply for it. And now I see Steve. Hi, good to see you. And so I applied and I got the role because I'd been working on a 10% project with Becky to try and bring drop-in coaching to Google. And then sure enough, about a year or two later, hit another pivot point. The book was coming out. I was working around the clock, both at Google and then nights and weekends on my own thing. And at that point, I realized I did take a sabbatical, my ironic sabbatical that the reporter so nicely described. And I had every intention of coming back. But once I was on the road, I realized it's not going to be fair to either Google or to my own projects if I give them both a short shrift. If I spread myself too thin, I'm just going to hit burnout and not be effective anywhere to anyone. So at that point, I made the tough decision to go all in on my own thing and see if I could do it. And so I gave myself 6 months. And for the first year and a half, I rode the adrenaline of that. Like, okay, I can do this. I'm not going to prove everybody right who said you're crazy to leave, you're an idiot, how are you going to feed yourself? And so I kind of poured everything into my business until once again, a year and a half after leaving Google, I was asking what's next. I had written Life After College on podcasts and in interviews. I'd become the girl who left Google. And that was all anyone wanted to talk about, was what I had left behind. And I was really confused about what lies ahead. What do I stand for? What can I create content and a mission around? How can I be most helpful to people? Who am I? And this time I didn't have a steady paycheck to fund that exploration. So as my bank account dwindled down to zero, many of my biggest fears about leaving Google were coming true. I didn't know how I was going to pay the rent in 2 weeks. And that was really different than every other time in my career where I had asked, what's next? At that point, the question is not, what do you do if you knew you couldn't fail, but what do you do when your back is up against the wall? And I knew I could either solve this, and I pretty much had 2 weeks to do it, or I would have to leave New York or go get another job. And while neither of those things is categorically bad, it just didn't feel like the right thing for me. So in that moment, I came to one of two conclusions. Either there's something really wrong with me, and I'm destined to be unhappy in my career, and I keep asking what's next every few years, and there's a problem here, and I'll forever be unhappy. And I felt ungrateful. I felt ungrateful for hitting these points within Google and now outside of it. What is it going to be? Neither one, I hadn't clicked into my skis yet, if you will. But the second conclusion was that this feeling of a midlife crisis or a quarter-life crisis was actually accelerating. Not just for me, but for everybody. And that instead of getting granted permission for 2 of these in a lifetime, that because our economy is moving so quickly, and particularly in tech and Silicon Valley and a company like Google, we are going to be asking and answering what's next every few years. And that actually, I would expect nothing less. So as I looked at how people can be as agile as startups, one of the things I recognized was that when we talk about startups pivoting, it's often as plan B. The original strategy or direction has failed, and the startup needs to pivot to stay in business. So just like YouTube used to be a video dating site, it pivoted to what it is today, multi-billion-dollar part of the company. But when it comes to our careers, pivot is the new plan A. That when I think about what it takes to be successful, pivot is really a mindset that says, again, not that you have to make drastic career changes. I'm not here to say, oh, you all need to leave tomorrow. That's not it at all. But it's asking, how can I pivot? How can I grow within my role? How can I double down on what's already working and shift methodically into something new? As I started to understand, okay, well, who's really doing this? We hear about the term high net worth. These are people who, over the course of their lifetimes, accrue a lot of financial assets. And so we call them high net worth individuals. But for the people who, certainly those who work at Google, at least for the most part, and those that I started interviewing for my book, I consider them high net growth. These are people who really value learning, growth, and exploration. And when given the choice, they would make a lateral move within the company. They would take on a 10% project in addition to what they're already doing. They would bootstrap a business. They would sacrifice in some way, if needed, money in order to keep pursuing their learning and development. And that when their personal needs for growth are being met, they then turn toward making an impact. So ultimately, I call them impactors for short. High net growth individuals thrive when they're learning and growing. That's oxygen to them. But it's not just about me, me, me. People who are high net growth and ultimately high net impact also want to know that the work they're doing has an impact on their team, on clients, on the company, on the broader community. And Google is ground zero for this. That just the definition of Googliness, the people who Google hires, all of you are so smart and hungry and committed and adaptable and all of these qualities that you probably don't even realize how valuable they really are. And so this idea of hitting a pivot point, if you're high net growth, I would actually expect nothing less. And that once again, hitting these pivot points within your role are an opportunity to ask, what's next and how can I make the biggest impact? And there's a lot of, I mentioned the shame and blame that we see in our media and in the culture, particularly around millennials, but I actually think that it translates to those of you working at a company like Google, which is that, you're so entitled to want more meaning in your work or to want to make a bigger impact, that there's something wrong. Well, actually, so much is getting automated and outsourced that I think everybody is smart to say, am I using my strengths to the fullest? Am I making the biggest impact that I'm able? And what are some small ways that I can continue to do that and to experiment? We tend to think of growth as a very linear process. So we expect that if we look at growth on the y-axis and time on the x-axis, we're going along and we think it's going to be a straight line, kind of like the old career ladder paradigm, that you're going to get a job at Google or get in a new role here or even just take on a new set of responsibilities. And it's like, okay, great, now I'm set. I can coast. But what ends up happening is that our growth tends to naturally taper and we hit a pivot point. At that point, as we start to look ahead, we either see a plateau, and that's just a general feeling of, I'm fine, work's fine, things are okay. It's a little sense of stagnation or an active decline. That's where if you're in a role or have a set of responsibilities that's just really not a fit, sometimes our bodies will start sending signals, getting sick more often than usual. I had a friend who used to get panic attacks when she would get off the subway on her way to work. So that was a clear sign. Her body is now starting to ring alarm bells, like you have got to make a change. So at this point, whether we plateau or decline, the choice is to pivot. And by the way, if you're high net growth, if you're an impactor, studies show that boredom has some of the same physical manifestations in the body as stress. Increased heart rate, increased cortisol levels. And Tim Ferriss captures this well in his book, The 4-Hour Workweek. He said, the opposite of happiness is boredom. And that pretty much captures the impactor sentiment. So at this point, the choice is to pivot. When you think about a pivot, pivots can be very small, again, within your role, or they can be larger. And generally, the way to measure a pivot, and actually I have to give credit to Steve Maxwell, because Steve, back in the day, Steve is the best whiteboarder I know. And we would whiteboard things like comfort zone and stretch zone. And so credit to Steve, I've kind of rethought on the pivot axis. Well, what does this look like when you're taking on new responsibilities? And so if you're in your stagnation zone, that's one thing. It's a little hard to see here, but this next level is your comfort zone. Then the optimal range for change for impactors is in your stretch zone, where you feel challenged and it's edgy and exciting. And then if you try and turn too sharply, if you try and pivot too quickly, it might send you into your panic zone. You can consider this at any point, not just with a bigger pivot, but with any next step or project that you're going to take on. When I have coaching clients come to me and they say, I'm working at a big company and I've hit a plateau, my number one thing is to ask, what can you do in your role? I'm not the person that says, oh, you should quit tomorrow. I don't believe that. I think that we're in such a fluid economy now that And I always look and ask for them to mine what's right in front of them, what's already under their feet. So if I said to any of you, oh, the right thing for you to do is to quit tomorrow and start a business from scratch, that would probably send you into a panic zone. It's probably not the right move. I mean, maybe with rare exception if you've already got that planned. But really, the goal of a pivot is what next steps within your own career development will keep you in your stretch zone, feeling engaged and challenged and excited. And so this is something that you can gauge as you go with anything that you're doing, and also to look, where am I playing it too safe? Where am I hanging out in my comfort zone? Just so we're all on the same page, the way that I define a career pivot is a methodical shift in a new related direction based on a foundation of your strengths and what's already working. So it's not a 180. If I had left Google to become a yoga teacher, that would have been a 180. But instead, I was doing coaching and career development within Google, and I left to do coaching and career development on my own. Even within Google, I was doing AdWords product training, and then I did CTI coach training on nights and weekends, and I pivoted internally. When I did coach training, there was no career development team. It didn't exist. But I pivoted onto it once the team was formed. So you can see these are examples of leveraging something that was already working. And this is really important, and I will say this is the thing that the biggest mistake that I made during my self-employment pivot was focusing too much on what I didn't want, what I didn't know, what I didn't have. And I think that we inadvertently do that sometimes. When we vent to friends and family about work, it's what's bugging us. But it's rare that people stop and say, what is working? What are your strengths? What are your interests? What do you want? What can you double down on? So if you think of a pivot, it's like a basketball player. And this is the analogy that came to me when I was in my really tough spot, which is that a basketball player, when they stop dribbling, they plant both of their feet. Then they have one foot firmly rooted and planted in the floor. And that's their foundation, and that gives them strength and stability. And then they can scan for opportunity with their pivot foot. Instead of what I was doing, which was running around the basketball court like a crazy person. So the key of a pivot, of how I define it, which is different than what we typically hear in Silicon Valley, is that a pivot always involves doubling down, having this plant foot by doubling down on something that's already working. Before we go further, I would love for you, and if you're watching on video, this is something you can reflect on, but if you're in the room, turn to someone next to you and reverse engineer a recent pivot, specifically highlighting what the thing in common was. So to switch metaphors for a moment, think of it like a pole vaulter. Whenever you pivot, there's this pole, this point of leverage, that you slam it into the ground, and that's what catapults you in this new direction. So think about either a pivot that you've done internally at Google or the pivot that got you here. And go ahead and share with each other in pairs, because it's likely that you've all already done this, even if you didn't have the language for it. All right, let's come back together. I would love to hear a few of these, because it's really fun to hear how you've already done this. As Steve Jobs said in his 2005 commencement speech, it's much easier to connect the dots looking backward, and reverse engineering pivots is much the same way. Like I said, you've already done this, and I'm actually not here to tell you something new or something you don't already know. I'm just giving you language and a process to put around it. So I would love to hear either your pivot story within Google or what got you here, or you can nominate a friend if they had a particularly interesting one. Anyone? Don't be shy.
Right, so I'll start off and then see if someone else is likewise moved. Yeah, I mean, for me at least, it was volunteering on the Talks at Google program, like leading tours for the visiting speakers, trying to find a need there based on something that I was already doing, and then like you said, perfecting that skill and then expanding to the rest of the business and starting up the Talks program.
Cliff's a great example of starting something small as an experiment, and then later it grows into a full-time role, which is much more common and doable than you might think. Steve.
Hello.
Hello.
So my most recent switch was from a learning business partner role into managing the learning programs overall. And the pivot was, it's still in learning and development, but I realized I was actually trying to do a whole bunch of problem solving from the learning partner role, which was actually the job of the person who was running the learning programs role. So I wanted to do it. I was already trying to solve their problems, and then the position opened up, and so it just seemed very natural to sort of move into that.
That's so interesting. So you kind of doubled down on what you were already doing within the role.
Right. And what I knew was a deeper skill set that I hadn't been using recently, but I'd had from 20 years earlier that I developed deeply in college.
That's so interesting. I heard so many people who say once they find that next iteration of either their existing role or the new one, they say, oh, it feels like my whole career has been preparing me for this. And that I love hearing about latent strengths in waiting or in hiding that you're not fully using, but you look back and you think, oh, duh, I've had this 20 years. That's how I felt. I just trained a group of pivot coaches, and it was the first time in 5.5 years I was doing coach training again, which I used to do with Becky here at Google for Career Guru. And it was this deep source of joy that came back to me, just came flooding in like, oh, I've done this before and I can do this. And so I encourage all of you to think about strengths in waiting, strengths in hiding, even things that you enjoyed doing as a kid. I know that's a little cliche in the career space at this point. We hear it all the time, but it really is true. There are so many clues in what you've already done. And that's, if I only leave you with one thing today, it's that the answer to what's next is already under your feet. You're already doing it in some way. You already know it. It's not so far outside of yourself. So let's look at how to actually unpack this. I developed a 4-stage pivot method because, as anyone who did work with me here knows, I really love structure and templates and organization. And one of my favorite guiding mantras in life comes from the practice of agile development. And they have this phrase, each time you repeat a task, take one step toward automating it. And I felt like, well, if every time one of us impactors or high net growth individuals, if every time we hit a pivot point, we start asking what's next, and then we are driving ourselves crazy and taking it personally and beating ourselves up and feeling ashamed that we feel that way, well, that's really inefficient. And that bugs me. So how can we get better at asking and answering what's next? The pivot method is my unpacking of that, and both reverse engineering my moves and interviewing hundreds of people and doing coaching for the last 8 years. It's a 4-stage process that really starts from that basketball player analogy. So this is where we'll get a little interactive. The first stage is plant. This is the one that most people want to skip, especially if you're a problem-solving go-getter like everybody is here. The natural reaction is, I've hit a pivot point, what's next, what's out there? The first thing most people want to do is start looking outside of themselves. And what ends up happening is you're scanning without a plan. You're looking for the next thing without being grounded, without being rooted in this plant foot. So it ends up taking longer. It feels more stressful. You might feel overwhelmed by choices, feel compare and despair or analysis paralysis. These are the kinds of things that happen when we skip the plant stage. So number one is what's already working. If you look at this graph, it's what are your values, what's most important to you, what are your strengths? I love how Steve's example is about what are you doing within your role that might not even be in the job description, but that people keep coming to you for, or that you keep kind of working your way to. When does time fly? When are you the most in the zone? What is working within your role, whether that's 95% or 5%? Identify it. And this can also be outside of work too. What do you enjoy doing on the side? What do you do for fun? My friend Neil wrote a book called The Happiness Equation, and he says, what's your Saturday morning test? What do you do on Saturday mornings when you don't feel like you need to be doing anything else? And the second most critical part about planting is vision. I don't believe in asking, where do you see yourself in 5 years? I think that question is totally irrelevant at this point. Who of us could have said where we would be 5 years ago? Things are moving much too quickly for that, and certainly at Google. I know when I was here, we were reorging as much as we were orging. So there's nobody better at dealing with chaos and uncertainty than you, and sitting at the edge of that. But I do think we can say a 1-year vision. So 1 year from now, what does success look like? What would you be thrilled to have happening in your role? What does your ideal average day look like? What kind of impact do you want to have on your team, on your clients within the company, on the company as a whole, on the broader community? These are all questions that help, I call it in the book, put a pin in it. So just like in Google Maps, you know where you're starting, and now you've got to put a pin in it. And the reason a lot of people skip this is, one, it seems kind of fuzzy, and for some it might be a little too soft, but it's really important. The other reason people skip it is often our gremlins rush in. So as soon as we say something truly exciting, what I really want to be doing a year from now, it might say, you're not good enough, smart enough, capable enough, that's not possible, it's harder to move internally than it is to get a job. Like all the can'ts or the shoulds or even the how are you going to do that? I don't know if any of you have had this experience that you tell a friend or family member something really exciting that you want to do, and they immediately start peppering you with hows. How are you going to do that? How are you going to fund that? How are you going to have time for that? And so it kind of starts to shoot it down before the vision is even developed. When we're doing coach training, I often describe the vision. It starts as a black and white photograph, and the work here is in blowing it up to a 3D movie. The more vivid that movie, that vision, the more clearly, the more effectively, and the more efficiently you can scan for opportunities for what's next. So now just take a moment, and in fact, we'll just give, let's say 30 seconds, even with your eyes closed, and think about what you're currently enjoying most and what's working best. Because I know not everyone has pen and paper, which is a real throwback. And now start to reflect on, what does success look like a year from now? So a year from now, how do you want to feel? And again, I encourage you to close your eyes. If you're watching on video, you can definitely jot things down on paper and pause. What does smashing success look like a year from now? I encourage you to spend much more time on this. When I'm working with coaching clients, sometimes I spend a month or more on each of these stages. So we're doing 30 seconds, which is just the tiniest tip of the iceberg. But you start to get a sense for how to work yourself through this process. And I also encourage you, if you do this later, don't stop brainstorming. Keep going. Go for your stretch zone. It's often the case that when I say, what does success look like a year from now, people give me something pretty safe. What feels reasonable? And I encourage you not to do that at these early stages. Instead, go for quantity, write down as much as you can, and then later you'll get a chance to narrow it down. The next stage is that once you're rooted, so once you know where you are and where you want to end up, these form the brackets of your pivot. And now we have a much clearer picture of this gap between where you are now, where you want to end up, and how to bridge the two. And the way to bridge this gap is through people, skills, and projects. So when you're scanning now, so we're rooted in our plan. So based on your strengths and your one-year vision, now we can look for people, skills, and projects that are connected to that. So the scanning is anchored. So the people, who do you admire? Who can you connect with? Who's doing what you want to be doing? I like, again, to use Steve's example, someone who had this role that he was really interested in. And when the role opened up, he knew he was perfectly positioned to move into it. So, and this can be within the company or outside of it. These mentors can be friendtors, friends of yours who you can brainstorm and collaborate and connect with. They can also be mentors from afar. It's perfectly fine if you want to say Larry Page and you look to him to see what is he doing, how does he manage his next move, or even podcasts, books. There are so many ways that you can learn from people that it doesn't all have to be people within your direct access. Skills. Usually when we're here and we want to get here, there's a skill gap, and that's exciting. That's the whole point of wanting to plan our next move is how can I learn and grow? That feeds our soul as impactors. So what do you want to learn? What do you want to become an expert in? Get strategic about what skills, if you were to develop them further, would most help you move from where you are now to where you want to go. I mentioned while we were fixing the slides that when I applied to the job at Google, I was absolutely terrified to speak in front of people. And I mentioned I got red hives all over my chest and neck. So I applied for the training team role because I knew that that skill set of being in front of the room and somehow trying to remain calm and not embarrass myself with my physiological response would be a good asset to have someday. And that's what's allowing me to be here now and not be freaking out and not be wearing a turtleneck. So skills is important, and then projects. Then you can start to narrow down projects that are going to be, again, based on what you identified in the plan stage, exciting to move into. So I know we're doing this all kind of in our head at the moment, but close your eyes for another 30, well, we'll do a minute total, but 30 seconds on who do you admire? So based on your one-year vision, who's currently doing things that are interesting to you, either within the company or outside of it? And who might you talk to? Who could you schedule lunch with? Okay, once you have a sense, so scanning is about seeing what's out there. And then the third stage, pilot. So this will be near and dear to your hearts as Googlers. Certainly, I share so many stories of Googlers in the book and so much of my philosophy around applying, pivoting to career comes from what I learned at Google and what I learned both doing training and then later moving into coaching and career development. Pilot, we talk about pilots all the time at Google. Pilot programs, pilot launches. So it's a way to test an idea and see how it goes. I mentioned in the book, there's a chapter, it's called Get Scrappy. So we know, and I directly say this is something I learned at Google, launch and iterate. And what's different is applying that to career, because a lot of people put pressure on themselves when they think about career development to have the next huge move. And there's so much pressure. And when we're thinking on the old paradigm of the career ladder, there's a lot of pressure to try and magically jump from one rung all the way up to the next. But instead, if you can think about career pilots, smaller experiments, think about your own personal 10 or 20% projects in your career, then you could be much more agile. So I mentioned that I like to use the analogy of your career as a smartphone. So your education and your upbringing is your out-of-the-box model. Then it's up to you to download apps for different skills, interests, and experiences that are exciting to you, just like what we've done in the plant and scan stages. Well, piloting is all about downloading an app. Becky and I downloaded an app which was a 10% project of trying to build this drop-in coaching program with a whole team of people early on. Cliff had an app of volunteering to manage talks when it was not at all your full-time role. It was just a small passion project. And even doing campus tours is a really interesting career pilot. So I encourage you to think about how can you now test what hypotheses you've come up with in the plant and scan stages based on your strengths. So it all should build from what you've looked at previously. And a good pilot, a good career pilot will test what I call the 3 E's. 1, do I enjoy this new area? 2, can I become an expert at it, and do I want to? And 3, is there room to expand? So for example, when I went to coach training, I knew I enjoyed it. I couldn't believe that my bookshelves had come to life and there was a room full of people that were interested in talking about things like human potential and fulfillment in life. Okay, expertise. Could I become an expert? Who knows? But I was willing to try and invest in that and feel really awkward and nervous. I used to be sick to my stomach before coaching sessions because I was just nervous. But I kept pushing through that. And then expansion. At that time, there was not a role for me to be a coach within the company, but by continuing, it built naturally. I share Seth Marvin's story in the book. Seth started Google Serve as a response to a Google culture idea call out one year. And the first year, he had 7,000 people from 40 countries, and it was over one day. And the following year, he doubled it. He had 14,000 volunteers from 70 countries, and it was a full week. And then over the years, again, there was no role at the time, but he ended up pitching a role managing Google's volunteer outreach full-time. So that's a great example of just, you know you're enjoying it, he's becoming better at it, he's proving the market, so even within the company, kind of proving the market need and that, hey, this can really make an impact on the business, and then it grew naturally from there. So now take 30 seconds and think about what experiments could you run in the next month. So based on the skills and the people and the strengths that you've already identified, think about, this is kind of comfort zone to stretch zone. Okay, so think about things, and a career pilot could even just be having lunch with someone. So they don't all have to be massive projects. Okay, close your eyes, take 20 more seconds to brainstorm on this one. Small experiments, go for quantity, not quality at this point. Now think about in the next 6 months. What would fall in your stretch zone? Reconnect with your one-year vision. What pilots would most move you toward that one-year vision that you identified that you could run in the next 6 months? Okay, time. Again, you could spend a whole lot longer on these. This is really fun to brainstorm. So I encourage you to, again, go for quantity over quality. Think about things in your stretch zone. Think of what would move you closest to your one-year vision. And know that pivot is a cycle. So you can plant, scan, pilot over and over and be perfectly happy. In fact, you can do this for years. And this is a way to frame career development that there doesn't necessarily have to be this 4th stage, which we'll get to in a minute, of launching, but you can continuously be plant, scanning, and piloting. You can continuously say every quarter, what's working? What can I double down on? What's out there? What do I want to learn? Great. What pilots can I run? And I love metaphors. So if you think about pilots like racehorses at the Kentucky Derby, they're like racehorses at the starting gate, and eventually one of them will pull ahead. but we don't know which one. I mean, even for me, Pivot just launched last week, and I've been working on this book for 3 years. It's my own pivot point. And people are inevitably going to ask, what's next? Which triggered my first existential crisis when my first book came out. And the truth is, I don't know. I really don't. I have pilots, I have ideas, I have hypotheses, but I actually have no clue which of my income stream racehorses is going to take off. And so part of, and again, what you're so good at already, being in the Google culture, is being okay with that. And it's one of the biggest things that I learned writing this book. From the time I interviewed people to a year and a half later when I went to fact check, almost nobody had stayed in the same place. Both by choice and by circumstance. People got hired, fired, their companies got acquired, then they got fired. They quit their jobs, they started their own business, they hated their own business, so they went back to a job. I mean, I saw it all. I saw it all. And even within Google, we know that things change so quickly. And you think you're in one role, or then your manager changes, or the company, the org changes, or the building changes, or you go work at an office abroad. So there's so much going on. And you can kind of always be looking at, what do I want to double down on? What is working, and how can I do more of it? Sometimes there is a launch moment. So that's when you go all in on a new direction. My editor and I were very clear. We actually took out the word leap, which this used to be called leap. And we realized that when you follow the pivot method, it's not a leap anymore. It's not a blind leap. It's not a jump. That you're reducing risk by piloting, so that by the time you do go all in on something, you take a new role, you move to another team, you do go work in an office abroad, you're more clear. There's less risk. It hasn't sent you into your panic zone. You have very methodically worked your way into that launch where it becomes really clear. And of course, there will still be some uncertainty and some fear, but nobody that I talked to regretted their launch decision, no matter what their move was, which I found really interesting. So I say in the book that if you're an impactor, we don't have FOMO, we have FONT, fear of not trying. That ultimately our biggest fear is to have an idea about ways to better leverage our strengths to make a bigger impact. Our biggest fear is not to try. So ultimately, when you're ready to launch, a lot of people ask, well, how do I know when I'm ready to launch? Is when you know that you would rather try and fail, which what does that even mean, than not try and stay in the same place. So we didn't use paper, so there's nothing to circle. But I would love for you to now turn in pairs. These are two of my favorite questions. You can ask them of yourself on any project. You can even use pivot method on projects that you're stuck on. But consider and turn to someone next to you and just share one small step you can take in the next week based on everything that you were reflecting on, and what next step would make the biggest impact. And these can be professional or personal. For some people, their skills, it's like cooking or salsa dancing, and that would be an app they want to download to feel fulfilled. So go ahead and share in pairs, and we'll do some as a group. Great. Okay, in the interest of time, we'll keep moving, but I encourage you to share these, ask each other. It's also one of my favorite questions now when I meet new people is, and even talking to other Googlers, to ask about their pivots internally or what they're thinking about next. This can also be used as a conversation framework. So a lot of times when people come to us and they're stuck and they say, oh, I just don't know what I should do, our first instinct is to jump to giving advice. But actually that sort of robs them of their own, facilitating their own thought process and being the expert in their own life. So you can even apply pivot as a conversation framework where you say, well, what is working? What do you want? What's out there? What can you try? What's a small next step you can take? And you can see that's less than a minute. So you can do this in as little as 10 minutes with someone. And so I encourage you, that's also a nice way to try having conversations with other people to frame it up in a really strengths-based approach. One of my favorite quotes is from poet David White, who says, that which you can plan is too small for you to live. One of the things that I feel most passionate about is just to release you all of the pressure to have to know in perfect specificity what's next. And that actually you don't need to. And if you did, you would be bored. And that even Eric Schmidt and Jonathan Rosenberg in their book, How Google Works, they talk about smart creatives. And that we do all this work to bring in smart creatives, and then they inevitably want to change and shift and grow. They say, still, fight like hell to keep them. And I love that perspective, that it's like, would we expect anything less of anyone in this room than than to feel this way, that which you could plan is too small for you to live. So as uncomfortable as the uncertainty can be sometimes, I wish I could convey that it is such a ninja skill that you're all developing. That as I did the research and what does it really take to be most agile in a modern economy, one of the things is the ability to handle uncertainty. If you work at Google, check. Another is openness and willingness to try new technology. Once again, check. The third, we're moving from knowledge workers to relationship workers. That actually, we're at peak data, peak information, peak content online. And that with automation and robots and outsourcing, that the real value is in becoming relationship workers, collaborating. Once again, check. You have everything that you need. And if you've hit a pivot point in your role at the company, you're human. You're human. This is to be expected, and this should be celebrated. And again, it doesn't mean that these have to be big, drastic changes, but something I'm so passionate about is just giving us new language that's gender neutral and judgment neutral. So pivot, it doesn't have to be a crisis. One of my personal mottos that I've adopted is build first, then your courage will follow. I came to realize that courage doesn't drop down from the sky. When we want to make a move, sometimes we're waiting. Oh, when I feel courageous enough, I'll do this next thing. I'll approach my manager about this idea that I have. But actually it works the opposite way. That when we just start taking small steps and planting seeds and running pilots pretty much on faith, not knowing what's going to work, but trusting that if we keep trying these small experiments, something will click. That's when we really start to feel progress. And in taking those steps, we start to feel more courageous. And that actually actually fear, insecurity, and uncertainty are the biggest doorways of opportunity that we have. So when you feel those things, when you're asking what's next, you can stop taking it personally and know that you're absolutely on the right track, and that in asking those questions, the answers will come. And that you don't have to have every next step mapped out. The only move that matters is your next one. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
And if you want to learn more, there's the book, and I have a pivot podcast, and there's a full toolkit online. I have about 40 templates for things like ideal day, knowns and unknowns, pilot, brainstorming. That's all at pivotmethod.com/toolkit.